Now we come to a period of Q&A. So I'm going to kick this off with a general kind of question that I have a feeling Ken won't like. So here we go.
Yeah,
I'm just wondering, in the notes that you sent to me, Ken, you describe yourself as a hardcore atheist. That's your quote there, a hardcore atheist, which kind of suggests that you're pretty much set in your ways. So I'm just wondering, I have heard you say in other debates and interviews and things, you say that you're open to the evidence, and I'm just wondering if that's really the case. Are you not perhaps, as a hardcore atheist, so set in your ways that actually no amount of evidence is going to convince you?
Well, some evidence could convince me. If the Virgin Mary appeared in my living room this evening, I think I would embrace that fact. Somehow I don't think she will. Why I say hardcore is because I'm used to some people who claim to be born-again Christians or apologists or what have you, who come out with a story that they once were atheists. And it usually transpires that sometime during their teenage years, they, maybe for one summer, they refuse to go to church or something. I don't think you blow in and out of the idea of being an atheist with such a cavalier attitude, or even just in a sense of anger.
Well, you are speaking to somebody who did actually go through an atheistic period. I can tell you it was longer than just a little season like that. But yes, you're right. I was brought up in the Methodist Church, and then I rejected it for several years and then became a Christian. But I just want to challenge you on this business about the Virgin Mary appearing to you. That does seem to be a extremely high standard of evidence that you're asking for there. It's like you're saying, well, I won't believe unless something absolutely fantastically miraculous happens. Is that the way you're conducting your research?
I say that in a certain sense of whimsy, Julian, because I've come across Christians, frequently over the internet at least, appeal to me to pray. And if I pray, they assure me, there's no doubt about it, they assure me God will make his presence known to me. And when I ask, and in what way, then they say, well, he will choose and you will know. And when I say, and when will that happen? They say, well, when he's ready and when you're ready. And you realise you're in such a nebulous area that if I was emotionally committed to the idea of interpreting minor things as acts of God, like finding my kettle on the floor instead of on the shelf, for example, that's why I respond by saying, well, let's say something that we can't just delude ourselves is a divine act.
Right. Yeah, I kind of get the thing you mean there. Yeah. I suppose really I was thinking more of not things that are sort of contemporary miraculous kind of things, but the evidence is, that you can sort of sift in history. And of course, your claim is that there is no evidence whatsoever. I do find that a really hard position, actually.
Well, let's do that. I mean, along the way, and Nick drew attention to the fact I hadn't commented on everything he said. He drew attention to the fact about synagogues, and I don't know what he was implying, but maybe he was referring to the synagogue in Capernaum, for example. Now, when that was first identified, Christians declared that was where Jesus gave his sermon. And yet, when archaeology established that it was actually a 4th century synagogue, well, then they sort of looked at their shoes and shuffled a bit, and then they identified a house not far away and declared that to be Peter's house. For Christians, they find confirmation wherever they choose to look, because they are wearing the blinkers, the rose-coloured spectacles of faith. So they will find evidence. An impartial observer won't find evidence. Yes, there was a boat found from the 1st century or maybe 3rd century BC on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. But to say that was St. Peter's boat is simply faith twisting information, twisting evidence to suit their own purposes. Why wouldn't there be boats on a lake that has been used for fishing for centuries? It's exactly what you would expect. That is the problem. It's the misinterpretation of evidence.
Well, that's certainly an example that you've come up with, but of course one could come up with lots of other examples. And, I'm just, I suppose I just want to pursue this just for a second, because I'm just wondering how objective you really are about this. I mean, I have a question about your website. It's connected to what we've just been talking about. And one of the things I notice about your website is that, well, at least it seems to me anyway, that you seem not to make much attempt to be objective in your assessments of Christianity. I know none of us can be wholly objective. I know that, we all
Sure.
have our biases, and but we can attempt to be critical realists in what we're doing. Try to be as objective as possible. I don't see you doing that, and I just want to pick out one example. On your site, you imply that Jesus is not very smart for saying in John 11:9. I mean, he says, "Are there not 12 hours in the day?" And you imply that Jesus was daft for not knowing there are 24 hours in the day, when the context is absolutely obvious that he's talking about the daylight hours of the day, because he goes on to say, if anybody walks in the day, he does not stumble because he sees the light of this world. And I know that's just one tiny
Sure.
little example there, and it's another whimsical example. But nevertheless, I do think that's somewhat reflective of what you do with the whole website, actually.
Well, there's a certain amount of whimsy. I agree to that. And I do that to make the subject more digestible and enjoyable to read, because it would be rather turgid and a slog if we stuck to a very academic style on the internet.
Sure. Yeah, but Ken, you could also make sort of amusing remarks of, a less dismissive way, but you don't. You choose always to be dismissive.
I don't, Julian, because I've long passed any stage of entertaining the notion that any Jesus of the New Testament existed. To me, it's very, very clear.
But you see, Ken, you'd have to surely entertain the notion in order to be objective. You can't even entertain the notion. How can you possibly claim to be objective in your assessments?
Well, I maintain a detachment in the sense, Julian, that if the evidence is there, I will consider it. When I write any article or prepare any video on the subject, I look at apologetic sites, I look at the standard Christian defences, I look at what they offer, and so much of it is simply embedded in faith in Jesus. It's there all the time, and every little aspect of it is twisted for the Christian message.
Okay. All right. Well, that's certainly very interesting. Yes, I wanted to turn to you, Nick. So, yeah, please do chip in.
Yeah, before you ask me a question, I'd like to respond to some of those things. First off, I actually happen to agree with Ken that many Christians give evidences for the existence of God that are far less than stellar, such as pray, God will reveal it. Christianity isn't Mormonism. Now, I'm not against someone who's seeking praying, rather seeking. I think that can be part of it. But if you're looking for evidence of God, go look for evidence of God. Don't wait for him to do something for you, because if he's out there, he's not meant to be your servant. I would suggest, for instance, reading the Aristotelian Thomistic arguments, which I find to be the most persuasive ones for God's existence. And yes, I do agree too many Christians read things into signs, use every little thing as a verification of their faith. I actually tend to have a strong skepticism about many, many claims. That's why I said, for instance, that the house could have been the house of Peter. That's possible. We don't know, but it's an interesting speculation. And as for a boat, I don't know if that was the very boat Jesus used. I'm skeptical of that. What it is an example of a boat, so we can know what they were like back then and get a better picture on the gospel story. And as for the eyes of faith, I think too many people really misunderstand what faith is. Faith is really trust in that which has been shown to be reliable. If you lived in the ancient world, for instance, let's suppose you wanted to open a bakery. You'd go to someone who had the money to help you start a bakery. That person would have been your patron. They would have given you the money. You would have opened up a bakery, and people would come, and you would give them bread, and then you tell them what a great patron you had and how wonderful he was. Now, the gift the patron gave you is carrots. If that sounds familiar, it's a word for grace. And your response of loyalty, that was pistis, which is faith. But yeah, I agree with Ken that there are too many flippant excuses used to justify belief in God. And I have a huge problem with a number of apologetics books. I've gone through some of them on my own blog and said, don't get this one. This is not good. I mean, I read some from time to time because I'm asked to review books. And I much rather prefer reading scholarship many times. I don't care if it's by scholarly apologist or what. It's just scholarship is much more engaging. And as for the writing style, I have no problem with being hard-hitting. If someone thinks their position is true, I think they should be willing to stand up for it. But yeah, we should also always be definitely watching and making sure that we're being as objective as possible. Now, you have a question for me, Julian?
Well, actually, I just wanted to follow up on what you... Ken? No, I'm in charge. So, Nick, I just wanted to follow up on something you said there. Ken, is there something to be said for perhaps you, Ken, going after the worst of Christian apologetics in order to find a straw man to knock down?
Well, let me say this, Julian. When you get into this business, right, from my perspective, you don't have a choice of your opponents. They come from every direction. And so I have very liberal Christian friends and people who actually don't believe 90% of what's in the New Testament. And there are other people who write to me who believe every single word of the New Testament. And on a daily basis, I'm responding to this whole mixed bag of criticism or attack. And so, if you like, I don't use a gentle approach because I'm so used to this campaign. And yes, I don't know whether somebody, as many do, simply will be quoting scripture at me as if that's the last word, or they will have a more nuanced position and actually offer some real evidence. It seems to me, from what Nick just said, he is actually open to what I would call historical evidence. So in that sense, we are coming closer than perhaps some of his co-religionists who wouldn't debate in that area.
So Nick, do you have a question for Ken at all?
Well, I would say, what Ken just said also, I always encourage Christians, I talk to them, read the best scholarship on both sides of an issue. And if you don't read on an issue, don't talk about it. You'll end up embarrassing yourself. But some questions I could ask. You were making the point about the Gospels. What genre do you think the Gospels fall in?
Historical fiction.
Do you have any scholars who agree with that?
Yeah, quite a few of them. And there's a list of them, Nick, on my website that is about a yard long. The number of scholars who are now mythicists is growing day by day, month by month, year by year. And you can take that as so because now so many Christians like yourself are complaining about it. It's an idea that is coming into its own time.
What's the qualification for being a scholar?
Well, that's tricky. I don't think one needs to go to a Bible college in the Bible Belt to be a scholar. Some of the greatest scholars of all time were self-taught individuals. But one hopes that people can write standard English and articulate an argument in a correct fashion. That would make them a scholar. I would hope they know what they're talking about, for sure.
So when you say that you have this yard long of scholars, then a lot of them could be just presumably bloggers. Is that right? I don't know. I'm not saying that, therefore they shouldn't be writing, but I mean, is that what you mean?
I would say there's a lot of intelligent people, Julian, whether they're just bloggers. I don't suppose anybody is just a blogger. Most bloggers have got some sort of academic background of some sort.
Absolutely. Which is why, yes, I was trying to say I don't think they shouldn't be writing or what they're saying is not valuable. I mean, I'm a blogger myself, so there you go. Exactly. But I just wonder what you meant, because I got the impression Nick was talking about credentialed people within a certain area of study, whereas you're not. So there just seems to be a difference between what you two are talking about. That's all.
Yeah, but you say, Julian, you would know that the establishment of biblical studies has, from its beginning, been dominated by believing Christians. The first critics of the church were theologians who began to notice some of the errors and contradictions. And what happened to so many of those people is they were driven out of their positions within those places of study and ostracized by their community. And that is still a danger if you denounce the story as a myth.
Within biblical studies.
You recently had Thomas Brodie, who was the director of Dominican Studies in Ireland, came out with a book saying that Jesus was a myth. And what happened? He subsequently lost his post as director of the Dominican school in Ireland. So you see what happens when you break with the conventional opinions of the prevailing in New Testament studies.
Ken, the problem, though, is that many of the people on your list, indeed, they're not scholars. I mean, if you're counting someone who has a blog and speaks intelligently and such, I would hope I would be included in that group, but I would in no way call myself a scholar. A scholar is someone who has reached PhD level of research in a credentialed field and has passed peer review in that field. I mean, Richard Dawkins, for instance...
That would be a very contemporary sort of definition of a scholar.
Richard Dawkins, for instance, would be a PhD in the area of zoology, I believe, and so he could comment on biology and something like that. But if he comments on philosophy, unless he's done the study there, which he hasn't, he is outside of his turf. Now, someone like, say, Richard Burridge certainly counts as a scholar in the New Testament, but he's not going to count as a scholar if we're talking about psychology. So, I mean, when you say you've got a long list of scholars, I don't think you really do. And so what I'm wondering is, for instance, when it comes to the Gospels as historic or fiction, have you interacted with a real scholar who is credentialed and accepted as a scholar by scholars, such as Richard Burridge?
Nick, if you need names, and if any of the listeners need names, they are in an article on my website, which is Jesus Never Existed Scholars, right? And that list grows all the time. Now, yes, many of them may not reach your current and contemporary definition of a scholar. In other words, it's someone who attends a PhD course at one of your seminaries or biblical schools. That's a very narrow definition of scholar. A brilliant mind is a brilliant mind, whether he goes down that particular avenue or not. And such people have, throughout the history of mankind, written much of our history.
It is the case that in a lot of biblical studies departments, there are people who do not believe that, Jesus is the Son of God, etc., but they nevertheless believe that Jesus is an historical character. And it just seems to me, what kind of onus is there upon them to reach that conclusion? They seem to have a tremendous amount of freedom to reach their own theological conclusions, and yet many of them say, yeah, well, Jesus did in fact exist, and there could be a large yard-long list of names to add there as well.
Indeed. But let's put that in some sort of historical context then, because a century or two ago you wouldn't have been able to say that, but now we do have scholars who have a minimalistic interpretation of Jesus. So I agree with you. They do exist, and they say, well, he's not a son of God. He didn't do all these things at all. It was really quite a minor character. That is absolutely so. The problem is they come up with different characters. Their minimalistic Jesus is actually almost a personalized one. There are many different shades of opinion as to who this minimal Jesus is. But I would then say, well, let's look at what's happened to the biblical patriarchs in the last 30 years, because they went from being literal and historical characters in the Christian mind to being marginalized as doubtful, and now are basically dismissed as mythical characters. This is the result of modern study of the subject. These characters are losing their place in history and gaining a place in mythology. And even Nick said Jesus was not a person worth talking about. So we can see how we're going down this road.
Yeah, okay, turn to you then, Nick, to respond to that. What do you reckon to that?
Yeah, well, when I said Jesus wasn't a person worth talking about, it's because he died a shameful death on a cross, and no one wanted to talk about that. But the main things I can talk about is that, yes, the definition of scholar is narrow. It's supposed to be. Not just anyone can call themselves a scholar. But getting to the main questions that we need to be talking about here, for instance, you talked about the Gospel of Mark. Kim, do you know what an inclusio is?
Sorry?
Ken, the question was, do you know what an inclusio is?
I'm not sure what Nick is referring to, no.
Okay, an inclusio is where you...
Oh, enthusio, did you say?
No, an inclusio.
Right.
INCLUSIO, inclusio.
No, go on.
An inclusio is where you start with a statement or a referent, then you end with that same referent, and everything in between is supposed to be connected to that. For instance, in the Gospel of Matthew, we find that Jesus is called Emmanuel, God with us. In the end, it says, I am with you always to the end of the age. The whole story then is this is about God with us. Now, do you know who the first apostle is named in the Gospel of Mark and who the last one is?
The first apostle and the last apostle
that are named in the Gospel of Mark.
No, but it's easier for you to say because I'm having to rack through my memory to do that.
Okay. I'll go ahead and say it's Peter. And the reason this is because, as Richard Bauckham has argued in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Mark would be writing the eyewitness testimony of Peter. And since these were things that Peter would have witnessed, that's why you wouldn't have something in there like the virgin birth, for instance. And in fact, to give further credibility to the account, if a church is sitting around thinking of names for the gospel and say, okay, we got this one here, this short little one, what kind of name do we want to give? Now, you can go with Peter, who's this head apostle, Jesus' right-hand man, as it were, high position, or you can go with little Mark here, who's a mama's boy who ran away during a mission of Acts and caused a rift between the first two great missionaries the church has. Which one are you going to go with? Are you going to go with Mark or Peter? And strangely enough, the church went with Mark. The only reason I can think of they did that is because they knew Mark was really the one who wrote it.
Well, it's a point of view. I don't think you can prove that so, but it's an argument.
It's a point of view and an argument, and it needs a defeater if you're going to say something against it. But if we move on to the writings being anonymous, do you know who wrote Plutarch's writings?
Did you say who wrote Plutarch?
Right.
No, why don't you tell us who wrote Plutarch?
You don't know who wrote Plutarch?
I would assume Plutarch, but perhaps it's a whole...
I have to say, I think, Nick, this is perhaps a style of questioning that is not quite fair. So I wonder whether you could move to a different style.
Okay, well, the reason I say who wrote Plutarch is because Plutarch's writings are for the most part anonymous, and we know that he wrote them largely because his grandson said it later on. There were a lot of writings that were anonymous in the ancient world, and E.P. Sanders in his book, Historical Jesus, has argued that the Gospels would have made themselves anonymous simply because they wanted to attract attention to Jesus and said, this is Jesus' life according to so-and-so. But meanwhile, some scholars like Martin Hinger and Richard Bauckham have argued that, in fact, the scrolls would have originally contained the name of the writer of the account. In fact, when we look at the church history, the fathers are pretty much unanimous, aside from the Gospel of John, on who wrote the Gospels, and even in John, they agree that a person named John wrote the Gospels.
Nick, I have a question for you. This is really echoing what Ken was saying a few minutes ago, how,
Sure.
in his opinion, modern scholarship has continued down the trajectory of apparently showing that the patriarchs didn't exist. Is your own research backing up what Ken is saying there?
Well, I'm really not an Old Testament researcher, so I can't argue for sure. I do know that there are ones that are like Finkelstein and such that are popular that do argue this kind of notion. And I can say the arguments I've seen, I'm not really entirely convinced. I think a good counter to that could be Hofmeyr with his books, Israel in Egypt, and I believe Israel in Sinai. And he gives some good, interesting evidence when you can look at works like a Treaty of a Great King that shows that Deuteronomy was a suzerainty treaty. And I am definitely looking forward to John Walton's book coming out, The Lost World of Adam and Eve. Should be out next year. John Walton is, at this point, my favorite Old Testament scholar. Highly recommend his work.
Okay, well, that sounds like an area that we can't really discuss very much if you're not into that particular area very much. So, Ken, do you have any particular questions you want to put to Nick?
Well, there's one I could ask him. It's a question of detail, but it'd be interesting to see where he's at, because obviously Nick has got some openness to neutral information. I'd like to know what he does feel about the saints mentioned in Matthew 27. Did they rise from their tombs and march into Jerusalem after the resurrection?
Actually, it's not what I feel, it's what I think. And my answer at this point is I really am not planning on saying anything whatsoever, because that is the area of my research, and I don't want to say at this point, yeah, I think this is what happened, or no, I don't think this is what happened, because that could sully my research before I get into it, and I'm trying to be as open to both sides. I can say I do find convincing arguments on both sides.
Okay, could you tell us then what the two sides are, roughly,
Sure.
in that debate?
Well, one side is pretty straightforward. The idea is that this really happened. This was a historical event with some number of people rising up from their graves and going into a city after the resurrection of Jesus. The other side, put forward especially by Mike Lacona and held by other people such as Michael Bird and William Lane Craig and still others, is that this is an apocalyptic event. And what it is that in Greco-Roman biographies, when a great king died, you would find numerous events happen of a miraculous and unique nature. And these were meant to show that a great king had died. And there can be no doubt that Matthew is writing to depict Jesus as a great king. And so what this is kind of like flavor text, as it were, special effects meant to illustrate that
Special
Jesus
effect.
was a great king.
Right. So this could be like a literary convention then. So when we go to, say, Mark 13, which is often called the Little Apocalypse, there we find that Mark 13 is quite different from the majority of the rest of the Gospel, and it's because it's moved into a different literary style. Is that the kind of thing you mean?
Yes, and the ancient writer,
Julian, I must interject there, because although the language will be different and you call it a writing style, I would simply say it's fiction. either which way, we agree it didn't really happen.
That's an interesting way of putting it, Ken. Well, I suppose you would say that because you would think that the Jesus who delivered those statements didn't exist. So I suppose you'd have to say it was fiction. That seems to be to prejudice your judgment of the text itself.
You are talking about a pretty extraordinary event there, Julian, which has no witnesses and no other evangelist repeats the story.
Yes, I agree with you, and that is a difficulty with it, isn't it? That's right.
Julian, if I could say some things, I do know there are good counter-arguments to that position. Matthew, for instance, is the one most writing on messianic fulfillment, and this would be something that would be seen as messianic fulfillment, that when the Messiah came, according to some, the dead would rise. Besides, I'd like to get mainly to the point that you were asking about Mark 13. Yes, Mark 13 is written as what is called the Little Apocalypse. The last book I read on this was Jesus, the Temple, and the Coming Son of Man by Robert Stein, and I do interpret Mark 13 and the other versions of the Olivet Discourse as an apocalypse. I think we do a disservice when we read them in a literalistic manner, that we have to realize that the writers were using Old Testament language, and the readers and listeners would have recognized that. And the position of people like Lacona, Bird, and Craig, and others with regard to the resurrection of the saints would be that the readers of the time would know that Matthew is not recording a literal event, but he is recording something that's apocalyptic history, and it's not meant to be taken in that way. This was common in the ancient world.
Any comments to that, Ken?
Well, I think that says so much, Julian. It says so much. So we've moved from the literal understanding of the Gospels to what you are calling the apocalyptic writing of the Gospels. In other words, the authors are indulging in a style of writing that is not actually true and is not to be read as history. Now, okay, the one about the saints is notorious, but we could move on from that to so many of the others to demonstrate that the whole story is fiction. Did Jesus walk on water? Would we like to play with that one for a while? Is that apocalyptic? Was there really a star in the heaven that led the wise men to Bethlehem? Or is that more apocalyptic? What you have conceded is that there are fictional elements in the gospel.
No, I haven't. I've conceded there could be apocalyptic elements, and if a writer did not intend to write a part of it as history, then is not able to take it as non-historical. Yep. The writers did intend to write many things as historical, and what we do is we study each of these on a case-by-case basis. You see, part of the problem a lot of skeptics have is they make the Bible into an all-or-nothing game. It's all this or it's all that. If one account in the Gospels is seen to be problematic, then all of them must be problematic. That's just planting a seed of doubt, and that's not sufficient to overturn the evidence, especially the evidence of Burridge that the Gospels are Greco-Roman biographies and should be read in that light. It doesn't overturn the archaeological evidence, and it doesn't overturn the firm historical setting of the Gospels.
Nick, I think we can move from this point with some usefulness, you see, because I would ask you, how do you, as a reader of these texts, identify what is apocalyptic, as you call it, and what is literally true? How do you do that?
I would go and use good methods of historiography. One thing I would want to consult first off as a non-scholar, I would want to consult the leading scholars on both sides of the issue. Do I want to know what people like Bauckham and Lacona and others say? Yeah. I also want to know what people like Ehrman and Crossan and White and Martin
you go to authorities on the subject.
Well, I think that I'm coming from the point of view of both of you, really, in some ways. I understand your question, Ken, very definitely. And I understand, I think, Nick, what you're saying there, because these authorities would have reasons for saying what they're saying. Right. And, I have to say that this sort of flat way of reading the Bible, which I know a lot of Christians are guilty of doing, I find anathema, really, myself. And, when I read the Bible, I am very conscious that there is a kind of shifting between different genre of writing, even within, say, one gospel. I mean, you have to pick up the what theologians would call the hermeneutical keys. How do you unlock what a text means? It isn't all going to be at face value. I mean, one of the things, for example, I think of is, I look at Genesis 2 and 3, and I know a lot of people take that to be absolutely literal, and I disagree with them, because I think there are so many indications in that particular text that you're dealing with allegory, and that there really are many indications there. So, when you have the two trees in the middle of the garden, you are talking about those trees having theological functions, and so you should read it that way rather than reading it as just pure history. But you get that by looking at the text and picking up these little hermeneutical indicators that are there. And so I don't think you can actually read a text flatly. You have to have some sort of understanding of how these ancient texts work.
I'd like to ask, I heard Ken saying, so I'm going to go with authorities here because that was just my first starting point. But Ken, do you have a problem with my going to authorities? Do you think I'm guilty of some sort of appeal to authority fallacy?
I wouldn't say that on the evidence of what we've heard today, Nick. No, I wouldn't. You have mentioned a lot of names, and that's fair enough. But at the end of the day, any intelligent person has to form their own judgment. I would say that if you've got the capability of making your own judgments, then that's what you should do. And what I'm pointing out, I hopefully pointed out earlier, is there's an innate conservatism in the New Testament area of study. Those institutions are not there to be radical. They're not there to throw out new and challenging ideas. They largely protect the establishment of the church. They all do that. And you can understand why, from very human reasons, why they do that. You could probably find 27 other people within 200 miles of you who are scholars and who would say, yes, you're absolutely right, Nick. I would start with authorities. Of course I would. But then you have to extract what you can from that material and make your own judgment. I'm not inclined to simply endorse what was the official ideology of Europe for 2,000 years. That's why it's conservative, and that's why it serves its purposes that it does.
Ken, do you think the Jesus Seminar is conservative and bent on defending the biblical doctrines?
Not especially. And they threw out most of the Bible, didn't they?
And do you know who the co-founder of the Jesus Seminar was?
No, I know some of the names, yeah, but...
It was John Dominic Crossan, and you know he was elected president of the Society of Biblical Literature in 2012.
He's a good scholar. Yeah, he's a good scholar.
And is it not the case, chaps, that the Jesus Seminar, nevertheless, on balance, does believe that Jesus actually existed, which is what we're arguing today?
Yep, they do.
I would agree with that, Julian. They do. But you have to see the historical development going on here. 150 years ago, there would not have been a Jesus Seminar saying that. And people got into serious trouble for criticizing the church. We are in an age now where people are more skeptical and are challenging these ideas. And it's so interesting that after a huge and furious debate, how the church is having to give ground. The church is having to concede.
Well, I have to say, I think, Ken, this is a bit of a caricature, because, I mean, this kind of thing has actually been going on for hundreds of years since the Enlightenment, really, hasn't it? And many people would point to the fact that we have actually a recovery of the Jewishness of Jesus. And so there's actually a bit of a turning back in some ways to finding the real Jewish Jesus, which is something that seemed to have been shelved for such a long time. So I just have a feeling, Ken, that your view of history is this sort of movement of trajectory and this Enlightenment progress kind of idea, which I don't really see that as reflecting real history.
No, it's not a continuous movement for sure, Julian. I'd agree to you to that. There was more radical thought in the 20s and 30s than there was in the subsequent decades after the Second World War. And you're right. And it happened to coincide with the establishment of the State of Israel. But the Jewishness of Jesus was reasserted and reestablished. That's absolutely true. But it's interesting now that there's little academic defense for the entirety of the New Testament. That position is not really creditable, is it? But I'd like to get back to this. How do we know which bits to take literally then as being history? Would you say the Gospel of John is a historical document, Nick?
Yes, I would. And I would base that, for instance, that Richard Bauckham has said that John is the most eyewitness accounts in his work, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And I would also point out that Dale Allison has said much of it comes from an
so you turn to an authority. Would you accept then John's chronology over the Synoptic chronology? Because they're certainly very different.
Well, if you're asking that, I'd want to know exactly what areas you're wondering about.
Well, we could have the turning of the tables at different times.
Yeah, I actually think it's possible the turning of the tables could have happened twice. That's a possibility, because the first time it could have been that it just didn't end as well for Jesus, because we have him saying it, 46 years, and then he goes on his way. And then later on, when it comes to his coming in on a donkey, now he has more honor at this point. At this point, it's, hey, this has to be dealt with. Or it could be that John did change the chronology, which in the ancient world, if you were writing a Greco-Roman biography, it was acceptable. The audience would have known it.
Well, I mean, this is a classic, isn't it? The two overturnings of the tables in the temple. And how about the census? Would you claim, Nick, there were two censuses, one during the time of Herod the Great and one in 6 AD when Judea was made a province? This is just inventing ideas to keep the gospel story in the frame.
Well, first off, the truth or falsity of the census doesn't really change the existence of Jesus. But I actually interviewed Ben Witherington on my show last December on this, who is also a leading New Testament scholar, and asked him, and he certainly goes into the Greek a lot more than I ever could, but he does indicate that the event could have taken place, could have been the event described afterwards. In other words, Luke could have been writing about a census that was, in fact, one used as 6 AD and used a time frame in such a way that to tie the story of Joseph and Mary in without changing the date of a census. And censuses in the ancient world took a long, long time to complete. I think there's even one account of a census that took 40 years to complete.
Well, I'm not sure it's worth pursuing that particular point.
Okay, well, I think what's happening is we're getting into the details of too many bits and pieces, and we're losing the bigger picture.